Welcome to In the Red, Debt Collective Substack. We are going live today. My name is Maddie Clifford. I am the creative media strategist at Debt Collective. And I'm really excited today. We're having kind of a surprise live. I know a lot of our lives are a little earlier in the day, but today we really just had the pleasure of talking to Joseph Strafaci. And he's going to talk to us about the SAVE plan, some updates, because there are always different things happening with the SAVE plan. And so before I introduce him, I'm going to give a little bit of context here. So July 1st is a major date on the horizon that's coming up. This is when we're going to hear as debtors from our student loan servicers. From that point, we supposedly have 90 days to come up with or choose a different plan. But here's the problem for 7 million people that are enrolled in SAVE, including myself. There's a lot of issues when it comes to switching plans. It could double or triple our monthly payments for one. Huge problem. I mean, people are worried about paying rent, putting food on the table. The last thing they need to worry about is another student loan payment, especially when student loans are like throwing money at a bottomless pit. Another issue is that the student loan servicers themselves, such as Mohila and Nelnet, are known to make lots of mistakes. Actually, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that when accounts undergo changes, there's usually like 1 in 5 accounts are going to experience some inaccuracy. And this is especially a big problem if, let's say, you're just about to get your cancellation from PSLF, Public Student Loan Forgiveness Program, or IDR, income driven repayment. And all of a sudden, your student loan servicer makes a mistake and doesn't tell you about it. Right, big headache. The last thing that people need to be aware of is that the Department of Education under the Trump administration, surprise, surprise, is continuing to wreak havoc. The student debt system is a dumpster fire by design, and the Trump administration is definitely capitalizing off of that. So the DOE has reduced staffing, already a big problem. So debtors are getting conflicting information, which Joseph is going to talk to us about. They're having difficulty completing basic tasks. So even if you want to pay back your student loans, which can't pay, won't pay, right? But even if you want to, it's really difficult to do it. And then the DOE is sending confusing information. So let's just get into it. Joseph, thank you so much for being here today. It's great to see you. I got to meet you actually for the first time yesterday evening, and you're just an amazing writer and storyteller. So if you would introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about how you came into this work.
Well, you're too kind, Maddie, first and foremost, and thank you for having me. It's actually a privilege to be here today. And, I think like to answer your question about like, why am I here? I'm a debtor just like you and probably just like everybody else who's attending this call today. And, when I say debtor, I mean like the full gamut. I have student loans, housing loans, auto loans, credit card loans, like, the open-ended loans, like, I've run through that whole thing. I've also experienced the debt system pretty intensely. Aside from student loans, like the house I grew up in was foreclosed on at one point. So, we were actually like I kind of seen that. I've been in court to negotiate debt on my behalf, and I've witnessed the horrors associated with that and how predatory the system can be. But aside from being a debtor, I am a structural engineer. I have a doctorate, so I'm also a professor on top of that. I work 2 jobs, which is funny because a lot of are talk about the 2-job type of person to make ends meet, and I never thought I considered myself in that because I looked at teaching as more of a vocation and a way of giving back, but it's actually a second job when you think about it because it does help pay the bills. Reason why I got into this was because I wanted to build stuff that would outlast me, quite frankly. That would be my legacy. And, a few years ago, I got involved with urban planning in particular because of the advocacy part of it. I really enjoyed public engagement. I'm an extrovert at heart. I really like talking to people in communities. And I really liked the Biden administration's kind of Justice 40 initiative, which was working with overburdened and underserved communities at that time. And so I went and got my AICP certification, and I've kind of been doing this advocacy work ever since, trying to, make my projects, serve everyone, and then kind of transforming that into, housing, debt, abolition, you name it. So again, appreciate you giving me the opportunity to even talk about this tonight.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I know that you do so many important things, and one of the things that you've been doing more recently is kind of managing or having a lot of a positive effect on Reddit. Uh, I'm a TikTok person and a little bit IG person. I don't know enough about Reddit, but just before you talk a little bit more about what you've learned from Reddit, can you talk about what are some of the misconceptions people have about the student debt crisis and who student debtors are?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question because I think that's a big thing that is a huge talking point as far as when they talk about why not to abolish debt. So, I think when you look at it, it's a very broad question. What are the misconceptions? And I think it falls into three buckets with overarching themes. And the three buckets would be basically who is being affected by this, who I would also say who's going to benefit. Why is this such an issue? And I guess there is a fourth issue now that I'm talking about it, but who would be hurt the most by this. And so if you're a safe borrower, I'm a safe borrower, during the Biden administration, Biden and then Bernie Sanders before him ran on the platform of debt abolition. And they talked about, abolishing that debt. And the talking point from what I would say from the far right or even the establishment Democrats was that people are getting a free ride based off of this. And time again, I would say personally, the people I heard getting the free ride were the Ivy Leaguers and the PhDs. And so, I have a doctorate. I think you may have mentioned that, or I may have mentioned this at the beginning in structural engineering specifically. I got it in 2020, right as COVID was starting, ironically enough. And, one of the things I don't think a lot of people know is that one, PhDs make up 2% of the population. So that's like 2 out of every 100 people. And in many cases, our education is funded, at least in my industry and in my field. I did research work. I have many colleagues who got their PhDs that did research work, and that's associated with grants. And so we're given stipends, and our tuition's typically paid. So student loans associated with PhDs are typically maybe housing. Like I know I had to take out some loans as associated to kind of make ends meet a little bit. I also I also like carry loans from undergraduate work and then from like when I got my MBA right out of college. And I know a lot of people had done the same or made that same, I want to say mistake, but they went down that same path because we were all promised, not promised, well, I guess promised. We were all promised kind of this notion of like, you educate yourself, you're going to get a high paying job and you're going to achieve like this American dream of a house, the whole picket fence and, being able to afford a standard of living that is very apparent that is just not the case anymore.
Right.
Um, so I think that, you know, is who's like the first is like who do the public think's being affected. Now, who is
Yeah, and
actually
if I could add anything to what you're saying as well, I think people don't realize too, one statistic is that half of student loan borrowers, they have the debt, but they don't have the degree. So also there are a lot of people that just haven't benefited from the degree in this way that people think that they benefited from the degree. So that's a large portion of people that aren't talked about as well.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the other thing is we talked about who is the average student debtor, and I think it's, the person who's being affected the most by this is the ones generally in the service industry. And I say this as like the service industry being a teacher, the IT worker you're bringing your computer to get fixed. It may be someone who went to school for lab, wanted to become a doctor, but didn't achieve that dream and instead is working in a lab. So now they're making less than what they were expecting. I think it was people also who, pursued these degrees at private institutions. I think the cost of tuition is a real big part of this. And I think people are entering into career paths and not being told what the median income is on the way out. I know if I was told mine, maybe I would have made a different choice. And I think a lot of people don't understand that and they're not given the financial literacy skills to understand that. But that's regardless of the point. We need teachers, we need a service industry, and those people deserve to have equity like the rest of us. And so, those are the people who I think are getting hurt the most. And I think that third part of it, right, is why is this such an issue? I think I kind of explained that, right? Like the cost of living in this country has become untenable. Do you think about what's going on in Iran? The cost of gas has gone up recently. These data centers are increasing everybody's utilities to a point that it's kind of ridiculous. The cost of housing has skyrocketed, specifically if you want to live in an urban area where, again, urban areas mean higher cost of living, but it also means a larger salary. So you are being forced to make these decisions. And, I'm pretty fortunate. I got to be honest with you. Um, I'm not, I have been fortunate, but I know a lot of people, are already at their wits' end. And the
Exactly.
ones being affected, it's between now they're already making these decisions. Do I pay my electric this month, or what can I get away with not paying this month and stretching it? And now you're going to throw this on top of it. And now it's going to get even harder because the payments, it's not even like the save plan. Now they're going to have to make these decisions and they might have to pay like double or triple what they were initially paying.
Exactly. It could potentially be workers' biggest bill coming up. And this is like really important for us to talk about. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation. So we know that the SAVE plan was introduced by the Biden administration. Um, at Debt Collective, we don't really believe there's any perfect repayment plan because we believe that the student debt shouldn't exist and it should be all be canceled. But what was the purpose of SAVE, and why do you think Trump just wants to get rid of SAVE? He has a whole bunch of other things to do. Why is he coming for SAVE in particular?
So that's a really good question. So I guess to answer like what is save, I guess first is it was the first question you had
Yeah.
asked.
Like,
So
why was SAVE created, and why is Trump coming after it?
yeah, so I think like you said, right? Like the goal is abolition, right? That's kind of what we believe. Save was a compromise. And that's how I've always looked at it. Save was a compromise between certain establishment and the right and the left to kind of get a plan forward that would get some sort of consensus. And
Right.
so what Save is kind of I believe what the term was beforehand was the pay as you earn. It's kind of similarly structured to that, and where you're making 5% payments based off of your annual income minus a cost of living adjustment, which is usually the poverty line. So it's like take whatever your adjusted gross income is on your tax return usually, and then you subtract like 37,000 off of that, and then it's 5% of that. So if, for example, for me, I was paying like $800 a month under Save. Under a normal IBR plan, I'd be paying 1,700 a month. Like that difference between the 5 and 10%. If you're like a teacher, making $60,000 a year, which was what I was making when I worked in government. Like I was paying like 500 under the IBR plan, but I'd be paying like more like 250 under Save if we were to go back in time for that.
Wow.
So, it really has an impact on the bottom line. There's also another benefit to Save that a lot of people don't really talk about, and that's the subsidy associated with interest. Um, the administration put a plan in place that they would cover the interest and cover the interest costs. And if my understanding is correct about this, and again, like, I'm not a financial expert. I just read a lot of data on this stuff and do a lot of analysis. But, when you take out a loan, right? And this is a big problem a lot of student debtors deal with is you make these payments under the IBR, and then at the end, um, your loan is forgiven, or you look down 20 years down the line and and I've seen this on Reddit, hey, my payments never went down. Like, in fact, it's more than what I originally took out. And that's because the accruing interest and the compounding interest, that's how these banks are financing the loans. Or I shouldn't say finance the loans, but that's how they're getting paid to finance the loans. And so, uh, to that end, the government subsidizing it is huge. So say if you took out $100,000 in loans, ideally by the end of it, you would only be getting $100,000 forgiven. So, and forgiven like is a misconception because it's not really being forgiven. What they're doing is they're wiping away your debt, but then there's a tax bill associated with it. And that's what a lot of people don't understand is that if they forgive, one of the nice things about Save, and again, I don't know if I agree with it 100%, is that it should be abolition, but with the forgiven debt, depending on what your balance is, you could be looking at a six-figure tax bill, and now you're dealing with the IRS at the end of this. And
Wow.
so this is how convoluted the system gets with this, and this is how predatory it can be for certain individuals who think they're doing all this, and then they benefit. Now, if I recall correctly, and I want to get back to more of this discussion, there was a plan in place to get that debt forgiven that was a part of that initially to be non-taxed. But I believe that date had expired per some bill. There was a time frame for it, and now that kind of is expired. It was, I think, for the people who are really trying to get their debts forgiven. So we're really in a bad place right now, I think, with student debt.
Right.
And losing the SAVE plan is going to be worse at this point.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, the Trump administration is they're really trying to come after Save. And I had a conversation with you recently where you talked about how Trump is kind of just trying to get anything that's associated with Biden. He's just trying to eliminate it. It doesn't matter if it's effective or not, but the name association is the problem. Can you speak a little bit more about that and the Trump administration's efforts, things that you've noticed? For example, the post that you put on Reddit and what you found out when it kind of went viral on Reddit.
Yeah, so that was a big surprise of going viral. But to your point with the Trump administration, right? Like, you're right in that it seems that everything Biden touched essentially, he's looking to kind of undo. And I think that's in part because he just wants to leave his mark at the end of the day. Do I think that he created this new repayment? I call it the RAP. I actually always forget what it stands for, but
Yeah,
I think
me
it's
too.
repayment assistance plan or something like that. But like, do I think he structured that? No, absolutely not. I think that was done by the Heritage Foundation personally. But that's just me. I would say that everything he does, like take the Kennedy Center, for example. This is like the best example we can use for everything. Like, why is it the Kennedy Trump Center? Because he wants to leave his mark and he wants to prove to everybody that he's the best. That's why there's this ballroom. That's why there's all these different things. That's why we have a big, beautiful bill. And that's why it's called the big, beautiful bill, because it's his mark and his lasting legacy on this country. But I don't even think sometimes even he knows what's in these bills personally, because I have to say, like, I grew up in the New York area, and I got to tell you, like, I'm really surprised sometimes because it's just like he was always in the New York Post, is all I'm going to say, and it doesn't seem that he would have the sophistication to pull a bill together. That's all I'm going to say about that.
That's okay.
Um, you know, but you know,
So what
he
happened when you posted on Reddit, though, in particular? Because when you posted on Reddit, you were showing some discrepancies between the communication from the Department of Education and, yeah, just discrepancies in your
Okay, so yeah, so the Reddit thing came about because I was actually on TikTok. I think you had mentioned you use TikTok and Instagram for a lot of things. So I was actually at a wedding in North Carolina. I was visiting one of my friends, and I get this like notification on my phone. I'm like scrolling through, and there was this guy. He was talking in a very threatening manner about how we as save borrowers we needed to make a decision that this day was coming. I think was the way he said it. And I was like, what is this? And I was like, I'm going to go enjoy the wedding. I don't care about this. Monday, I go and I look at it and I start reading into it. And there's these press releases that are being circulated. And it's like the SAFE plan is dead. And meanwhile, I got to tell you, Maddie, a few weeks prior, I thought it wasn't dead because there's case Missouri versus Trump was kind of indicating the exact opposite. That was very much alive. But what had happened was the judge had vacated and the Department of Justice had actually filed a motion on March 27th. Ironically or coincidentally, I'm not going to play conspiracy theorist here, but like the same day that the DOJ files their motion, they're putting out a press release that the state plan is dead, and then the Department of Education is posting on their website that it's illegal. And I got to be honest with you, I've been in the transportation industry and I've been in government adjacent for, I don't know, like 15 years. It's interesting use of phrasing. Like the government typically doesn't talk this way. So my antennas went up naturally. Monday, we get this email from the Department of Education on top of all this. And, as I'm doing this research into it, I'm like, okay, well, maybe they don't know what they're talking about. We all probably have gone in that Department of Education email that says action required. And, but there are options. And so you're reading it, and I'm laughing because the email is comical. I would say it's comical looking back at it. It is scary when you first read it, and I shouldn't be dismissive of that. But they go through about how the SAVE plan is dead, and then they start pushing the RAP plan. Like, but you have the RAP plan, and you can click here and enroll in this, and you can do this ahead of time. And then the next line says, but your loan provider won't be reaching out to you to July 1st. And then I think the most damning part of this whole thing is at the bottom it says to unsubscribe from these emails, click here. If this was a legal notice, Maddie, or if this was an actual we had to do something, like it would not have unsubscribe at the bottom. So, immediately I'm like, okay, this is totally a marketing gimmick. And this is not only a marketing gimmick, but seems to be a coordinated attempt to like get borrowers to, I would say, waive their legal protections under SAVE by switching into a plan. Because like you said, there's 7 million of us. If there was like a million of us or maybe a couple 100,000 of us, this wouldn't be a problem for them. It's dysfunction at its basic core. And they have to somehow transition 7 million people out of this safe plan while they have a Department of Education that's been basically gutted and they can't even get the disbursements right now. Like that's like how dysfunctional this has become. So, they send this email, and recently they sent an email, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, that I posted about. It was basically the same email again, kind of like, uh, I use the analogy. You remember the Trump citizen, like you buy the golden pass,
Yeah.
and they were like, "Oh, millions of people have bought this," and it turned out it was just like one person. This email is like, well, hundreds of thousands of people have already transferred out into the RAP plan. I was like, yeah, okay. Like, I'll see it when I believe it. Anyway, to answer your point about Reddit, I learned all this information and I don't know, like, I very much was like, what do I do with this? Like, I benefit. I figured it out. Great. But like, there's going to be people who are going to get hurt by this. So nobody's going to listen to me on, my Substack. Nobody's going to listen to me on Instagram. I actually wrote letters to WBUR and a few other outlets, but they're busy covering the issue in Iran. So I found Reddit and I found this student loan board and I was like, you know what? Like, I'm just going to put this all here and hopefully someone will see it. And to my surprise, it got over 1,000 likes and it got hundreds of comments. And, I've done a series of articles, one about the SAVE plan, specifically what we just talked about, another about an update on the SAVE plan when they filed like a week later. I've done one on this RAP plan, which has been kind of pretty much lambasted by a lot of financial advisors for multiple reasons, which we can get into if you're interested. And then I did one recently about like, hey, like this second notice came and like why you shouldn't have to do anything right now. The best
Right.
move maybe is just to sit back. And again, the engagement has been incredible. So, I would say that it's been pleasantly surprising in some ways that it's gotten as much engagement as it was. Cause I will tell you at the beginning of this, I felt pretty helpless in getting that news out to people.
But that's wonderful. See, that's the power of social media. Every once in a while, it does really amazing things. Can you share? This is probably going to be the last question for this particular conversation. I would love to have you back and talk more. Can you talk about some of the horror stories that you heard? Obviously, we don't want to share people's names, but anything just generally speaking in terms of what the miscommunication and confusion that borrowers in the Save program are experiencing, maybe that you've heard on Reddit or just from talking to people?
Yeah, so I think like there's mass confusion out there. I think the majority of the private messages I've gotten or some of the comments I've gotten have been a lot of thank yous. You've saved me from making a bad decision. I was going to do something, but then I read this and you kind of stopped me from doing this. So thank you. I think there's been a couple that have gotten me pretty emotional, like in that like people have said how they've been in despair, not to get into the specifics, but about how I saved them. And it is a lot to take in. That word despair, I think, would describe a lot of people right now. I think that a lot of other questions I've gotten have been specifics on their financial situation. And I think that's indicative of the larger problem that they don't know what to do. I've gotten questions of like, if I do switch, is this plan good for me? Is this or that plan good for me? And again, Maddie, I'll say this again. I'm not a financial advisor and, I'm not a lawyer either. So I like, I try to temper it and I'm like, listen, like, this is what I would do if I was in your situation, but like, you got to do what works for you,
Right.
And I never tell people like they shouldn't pay their student loans. I never tell people that they shouldn't do something. My goal is more to get the information out there because I've always felt like you shouldn't have to have a PhD to do all this work to figure something like this out.
Absolutely. I love what you just said. And I think that is really indicative of what Debt Collective is all about because oftentimes people come to us because they have some really big problem. I mean, that's part of the reason that I became involved with Debt Collective. I owe over $100,000 in student debt. I'm part of the SAVE plan or I'm enrolled in the SAVE plan. And oftentimes we're just trying to navigate our student loan payments, trying to understand the communication that we're getting because it's so bureaucratic. It's Kafkaesque. I've written about it before on this Substack. And one of the things we do is we start off feeling really confused, and then we meet people like you. We meet people, everyone has different skills, but we all are connected by one issue, which is student debt or sometimes it's medical debt, or sometimes it's back rent. It could be all different types of things that we're dealing with when it comes to our for-profit healthcare system or housing system. And we start to learn the tools that and skills that we can use to actually navigate and also get to as close to zero monthly payments, or even, as you mentioned, you learned a lot about credit card debt, learning how to get our debts canceled, because it's not like we owe our grandma down the street. We owe banks and creditors and the federal government, the biggest bank on the planet. And it shouldn't be like this, right? So the last thing I want to just remind folks of is we have a lot of different calls that you can come and join. We have calls that are associated with if you're trying to get PSLF, or let's say you're a California-based borrower. We have a lot of different campaigns that are happening within the student debt space right now. If you go to debtcollective.org/events, you can find out about all of our events. Also, Joseph and I were part of a Writing Your Debt Story workshop, which you can come to that as well. And we have, in particular, we really, really could use your help in filling out a survey. Go to bit.ly/saveplan26. I'll put the link in this particular live. But this is a survey that we're using for people that are trying to just basically share their particular experiences with Save. We're going to use this information to advocate for borrowers, to advocate actually for a pause on student loan payments, because as I mentioned before, the student loan system is a dumpster fire by design, and the Trump administration is just going to try to capitalize off of that dumpster fire. And so we're really pushing for our lawmakers to institute a pause on student loan payments. Last thing I'll say is that thank you again, Joseph, for being here. If you're watching, please subscribe to Joseph's Substack, The Civic Blueprints. And once again, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you again for having me.
All right, everybody. See you next time. Bye.